How's it going, folks? Mr. Z here again. And Israel and Hamas are still going at it. And it's got me thinking, it's got a lot of people asking, like, what is the future of Israel and the United States relationship going to be exactly? So the war is going on longer than Israel wants, longer than it expected this to go on for, and it's beginning to cost them on the world scene. People are starting to question their methods, are starting to question the nature of how Israel has conducted itself in regard to the Palestinians over the last few decades. Now, aside from places like Europe, we're also seeing in the United States an increasing number of demonstrations protesting Israel's methods. It's quite interesting. Among conservatives, and especially among the youth population, there is a growing degree of Israel skepticism, and it's something that's going to change the dynamics of how the United States approaches Israel in the near future. Now, we spoke before about how the Israel lobby and the prominence of evangelical Protestantism in the United States played a big role in the United States becoming extremely pro-Israel back during the Cold War, and sort of spun into this situation where we just sort of dug a deeper and deeper pit in the Middle East for the United States to get invested in. Now, at this moment, Joe Biden has continued demonstrating strong support for Israel, talked about providing them support and, trying to maintain their relationship with other more skeptical powers, especially those in Europe. But there is a clear diminishing of Israel's role among American politicians. And if not Biden, then it's quite possible that some politician in the near future is simply going to not see Israel as a favorable ally any longer. Now, for the youth population, this is coming from two different angles. On the liberal side of things, you have this perception of Israel as this colonial power. It is taken up land that's not rightfully theirs, and it has oppressed the local population there, and is currently leading to humanitarian crises. On the other side, on the conservative side of things, you have a lot of people saying, why are we wasting money in Israel when we have problems here that need to be solved? You have two opposing factions that are saying, look, I don't want to support Israel for this reason, I don't want to support Israel for that reason. And the baseline of that is they don't want to support Israel. The end of neoconservatism, the end of the Cold War, the end of evangelical dominance in American politics is going to lead to a shift away from Israel. And I think it's at the point where even if the United States stops being Israel's ally, for Israel it's not really going to matter. They're largely combating Hamas on their own. What the biggest risks they face are being in a situation similar to Rhodesia or South Africa, where there are foreign countries sanctioning them and refusing to trade with them, making them essentially a geopolitical pariah. But if we compare the situation that Israel is in today to the situation it was in the 1970s, Israel now has several allies. Israel has had time to develop and build up an army. Israel has nuclear weapons, a significant stockpile of nuclear weapons for the small country that it is. They are in a much better position to defend themselves than they were several decades ago. And if the United States, if all these European powers just suddenly pulled out and stopped showing any support for Israel, they wouldn't be screwed. They'd be able to probably hold out for a good while, and maybe they'd have to come to some types of compromises with more hostile states like Palestine and Iran, perhaps Lebanon. But overall, they're not in a state of existential danger like they were way back when. Now, because the United States sort of feels obligated to maintain a global presence, because it still is the global hegemon, of course there's going to be interest in maintaining Israel as an ally, as basically an outpost in the Middle East, from which to monitor states that might be hostile to the U.S. or even just rivalrous to the U.S. Syria as a proxy of Russia, for instance. There might also be like a slight fear among some politicians that, well, if we turn our backs on Israel, if we stop supporting them, then they'll go to Russia or China. Russia is unlikely, of course, because they are supporting Syria, and Syria and Israel are hostile to one another. But for Israel to say, well, the U.S. isn't supporting them anymore, perhaps I'll turn to China, not necessarily out of the question, a little unlikely, but again, not out of the question. It's possible Israel might find some common ally, more local to where they are, in the form of India, of all countries. There's a significant Indian support for Israel, given their, India's animosity for Pakistan, their animosity for Islam, and by extension, the sense of, oh, Israel's an anti-Islamic power here in the Middle East, or Asia, I should say. Middle East is kind of a vague term. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, it just means the Near East, it means Arabia, it means North Africa, it means all these different things. But yeah, Israel could, if it loses support from the United States, end up turning to a partnership with India, or perhaps less likely China. And I think this is definitely on the mind of a lot of Israel's politicians. Like, the tide of favor in the United States is slowly turning against us. We're not going to have this same zealous support that we used to, because geopolitically, the Middle East is going to be less important. No matter how you slice it, you could say, well, the oil from that region is going to be important. If oil is important, a conservative politician, an America First politician, is going to say, why don't we get it more locally? Why don't we trade more with Canada, who has oil, or do something in Venezuela or Colombia where there's oil? A Democratic politician is going to say, we don't want fossil fuels anymore. We want to move toward renewables. Thus the oil is a non-factor insofar as the importance of the Middle East, insofar as supporting Israel for that sole reason. The threats in the Middle East right now, it's primarily Iran. The threat of Iran funding terrorist groups against the United States, sure, that is still a threat, but instigating conflict, supporting Israel has sort of been intertwined to those countries attacking the U.S. That's been a major motive for a lot of these terrorist organizations to get the U.S. to stop supporting Israel. That would be the argument from the world police standpoint, of the neoconservative, neoliberal standpoint. Oh, we need to keep supporting Israel because, we need this outpost in the Middle East to, destroy threats to democracy, essentially. But neoconservatism and neoliberalism are also falling out of favor in the United States, so eventually that will probably be a non-factor as well. And now from a social standpoint, Israel is losing ground. It used to be, well, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is, a beacon of hope in the autocratic, backwards Middle East. Like I said, for left-wingers, they see Israel as this colonial power that is, oppressing the local population. They see it as essentially as much of an oppressor in the region as you might say Russia is to Ukraine. All the while, on the conservative side of things, the evangelicals are losing influence within the conservative movement. Power is now shifting to a more, well, on one hand secular, on the other hand is a larger Catholic presence in the conservative movement in the United States, not to mention rising non-denominationals who don't hold Israel in the same regard that a lot of evangelicals do. So for these reasons, I think Israel is definitely going to begin exploring new alliance prospects in the next few years. Not immediately, maybe not in the next few months or whatever, but the next few years, expect them to start courting friendships with perhaps India, perhaps not Europe as a whole, but certain European powers, because it's probably becoming more apparent to them that they can't count on the same zealous support from the United States that they once had. In any case, Israel's probably going to come out of this conflict all right. I think the real question is genuinely what's going to happen to Palestine and Gaza, because if Israel recognizes that in the long term, a partnership with the United States isn't viable, that sort of takes the gloves off when it comes to how they deal with the local populations. If the U.S. is genuinely disinterested in getting involved, then once again, sanctions and trade restrictions could be expected, similar to what's going on with, Russia. But yeah, Israel's position on the world scene is probably going to change to a degree in the next few years. But as for whether or not Israel's going to still be around as a state, most likely it will be. Worst case scenario for them at this point would be they go to war with Iran. Maybe Syria rebounds and they end up in a war there. But like I said, they're in a pretty decent position these days to be able to defend themselves. The main thing with Hamas is primarily the guerrilla warfare that's really giving them a hard time. So yeah, I guess that's the U.S. and Israel's relationship. It already looks shaky, and give it a few more years, it's probably going to be a lot rougher. But I think that's about where I'll end this video for now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.